Welcome back to Know Your Bible. And today we're going to study Genesis chapter 38. I'm Reverend Birgit Gaudreau, and some of my information comes also from Dr. Baruch Corman, and you can find him on loveisrael.org. So last week we learned in chapter 37 that Joseph's brothers planned a scheme to get rid of Joseph, and they did throw him in a pit and sold him as a slave. So this week in chapter 38 is a very important chapter. This is about the lineage of Judah. Judah is the fourth son of Jacob, and Leah was Judah's mother. And so here this lineage leads up to the birth of Christ.
This chart is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Here is Jacob and his wives, and over here you can see the sons of Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And further on you can see the wives of Judah, Shua and Tāmar. The bloodline from Tāmar is Perez and Hezron, the twins.
So Judah was disobedient, and he married a woman from the Canaanites called Shua, and this was not pleasing to his father.
Verse 1 to 5. It came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers, and visited a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. And he married her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And she conceived yet again and bore a son, and called his name Shelah. He was a Gezib when she bore him.
So in verse 6 it says that Judah took a wife for his oldest son called Tāmar. And in verse 7 it says, but Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. So at this time there was a law or commandment that if a woman's husband died, that the brother of the deceased would marry her and bring offspring for his brother so that his lineage would continue. And here you can read this in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5 and 6, and I'm just going to read that to you. So in verse 5 it says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. In verse 6 it says, and it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel.
Verse 8 to 10. And Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and marry her, and raise up an heir to your brother. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and it came to pass, when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, therefore he killed him also.
So the second son from Judah, Onan, did not provide the seed to bring heir to his brother. And so what he did is he emitted his seed, which means that he grounded his seed or his sperm instead of going into Tāmar. So Onan, Er's brother, was doing the act in a way so that Tāmar could not conceive, and this was not pleasing in God's eyes.
Verse 11. Then Judah said to Tamar his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown." For he said, "Lest he also die like his brothers." And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house.
So now Judah thinks something's wrong with Tamar, that the first husband and the second husband would pass away. So he's saying, "I'll promise you Shelah, my youngest son, when he grows up and is old enough to marry you." But he had no intention to give his youngest son to her because he believed that there was some kind of curse or something wrong with Tamar.
Verse 12 to 14. Now, in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, that's Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comforted, and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, and he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite went. And it was told to Tamar, saying, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in an open place, which was the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife.
So Judah's wife passed away. And so if you can remember, at that period of time, 30 days was the general mourning time. And then people went on their normal life. And so he was going on again out to the sheep and doing his normal daily work that he normally does. And he was on the way to Timnah. And there is an intersection, it says in Hebrew Bible. And on that intersection, sometimes a harlot would be there. This intersection was going into the city. And so at that time, believe it or not, there was a prostitute corner. But Tamar, she wanted to fulfill God's commandment. So she went a little further than normal in this case, but in her heart she knew that this was God's will, that she would conceive out of the lineage of Judah. So in verse 15, Judah sees Tamar but doesn't recognize her. She's covered, her face is covered, and she's wearing attractive clothing, and he approaches her. Well, it's been a while since he's had a wife. He lost his wife, and this act was really not pleasing to God, but still it was in God's plan because the lineage of Judah had to go on.
Verse 16 to 18. Then he turned to her by the way and said, "Please let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" And he said, "I will send a young goat from the flock." So she said, "Will you give me a pledge till you send it?" Then he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" So she said, "Your signet and cord, and your staff that is in your hand." Then he gave them to her, and went into her, and she conceived by him.
So Tamar wanted 3 important things right away from Judah. And that was one of them, a signet, which is a ring that he used for business. It was a very important ring to have. He shouldn't have gave it away to her, even for that short time. And the cord was a prayer shawl, which was also important, and his staff. So these 3 things were very important to normally very important to Judah, but it was very important for Tamar to have, to prove later on that he is the father of her children.
Verse 19 to 21. So she arose and went away, and laid aside her veil, and put on the garments of her widowhood. And Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand. but he did not find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, Where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And they said, There is no harlot in this place. Then he returned to Judah.
So in verse 22, Judah went and tried to find Tamar, the harlot, but he couldn't find her. And people there said there was no harlot here. So when they were looking for the harlot, Tamar, and couldn't find her, they decided, let's just forget the whole thing and leave it alone before we ask around, and a whole lot of people are going to find out that Judah was with a harlot, which was not very appropriate for him to do, and also that he lost his ring and staff, and prayer shawl was not a good thing either. So I'm going to read verse 24. It says, And it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, Bring her out and let her be burned. So Judah just wanted to have her burned and get rid of her like it never happened.
Verse 25 and 26. When she was brought out and sent to her father-in-law, she was saying, By the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, Please determine whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. So Judah acknowledged them and said, She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son, and he never knew her again.
So in verse 26, Judah admits that he was wrong by not giving his youngest son, Shelah, to Tamar. And so he calls her righteous. She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son, and then he never knew her again. So Judah did not marry her or keep her as a wife.
Verse 27 to 30. Now it came to pass, at the time for giving birth, that behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was when she was giving birth, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, This one came out first. Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, How did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah.
So Tamar was fulfilling God's purpose and plan, and when she became pregnant and bore twins, this was like a double blessing from God. So the firstborn, baby Peretz, that name means like power, to burst forth or to push forward with power. And so the secondborn, which is called Zerah, that means to shine forth. So we can see here that God's ways are not always our ways or our way of thinking, but God planned that this lineage from Judah would continue. And so it was God's will what Tamar did, and it was not pleasing to God that Judah did not submit towards the command at that time to continue the lineage. So that was the lesson for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed putting this lesson together. And please join me again next week as we study Genesis chapter 39.